This is Mark O'Connell. And Mark is a Dublin-based journalist and writer. And I first heard about Mark about, possibly 2 years ago. Alan Coss, who organises the meeting with us, has been sending me amazing articles that he'd written from various news outlets. And we were really keen to sort of get him involved in some way in the conference, and we couldn't really think of an angle until Mark wrote this book about people who want to achieve immortality, and we thought, perfect. And the book is called To Be a Machine, and the blurb, it's a bit of a mouthful, but adventures among cyborgs, utopians, hackers, and futurists solving the modest problem of death. So a lot in common with the rest of us. But he's been writing for a few years now. I think you've got a background in humanities, Mark?
Yeah, English studies, yeah.
Okay. So, and do you want to tell us a little bit? I mean, the main themes of the book relate to transhumanism.
Yeah.
And although I know, what the $6 million man is, and those sort of concepts, what is transhumanism? Tell us about it.
Well, basically, it's a social movement that's it's sort of like put down quite deep roots in the soil of Silicon Valley, but it's kind of a global social movement, really. And the idea behind it is that we can and we should use technology to sort of transcend the boundaries of the human condition. So to make ourselves smarter, make ourselves kind of immune to diseases and so on. And ultimately, the sort of end game is to become immortal, like literally immortal through technology, through either becoming immortal in your own kind of biological body, or the more kind of typical idea is that you scan the brain and upload yourself to a machine. So it's pretty sort of out there sci-fi stuff, but it is some version of this belief is held by a lot of people in sort of high up in the tech world. And so that's the kind of milieu that I insinuated myself into for the book.
So they're sort of ambitious.
Pretty ambitious, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a bit more than orthotics and glasses.
A little bit more than that, yeah.
So, I mean, you give a background in humanities. What was it that drew you to this?
Well, I kind of have a sort of a pathological attraction towards like gigantic sort of apocalyptic ideas.
Me too.
So, like, this is a big one, and I see it as increasingly see it as a bit of a weakness, but I'm getting away with it so far. But so yeah, I mean, I'd written a sort of a short magazine piece for a magazine called Mongrel that I used to write for shortly after I left college. So it's like 10 years ago now. And that was it was just quite a frivolous kind of piece about how this movement exists. There are these people out there, these sort of tech billionaires and so on, who want to use technology to become immortal. And I wrote it, and it sort of went out of my head for a while, but then, I mean, I write about this in the first chapter of the book. What happened was I became a parent for the first time, and I don't know whether this is normal or abnormal, but I became sort of preoccupied with mortality very quickly after that experience. Among like all the other great things about becoming a parent for the first time, one of the things that happened was I got obsessed with death. And so, yeah, I guess in a way, like the transhumanism thing kind of came back to me, and I started to become kind of more and more obsessed with transhumanism as this kind of movement that offered a way out of I should say, by the way, and I often forget to say this when I'm talking about the book, that I am not in any way a transhumanist, so I'm not here selling this movement. But so, yeah, like, I guess maybe like a psychoanalyst would say that the process was one of sublimation, and that I was kind of plowing all my anxieties about mortality into this weird kind of subculture and my obsession with it. So that's where the kind of idea kind of grew out of. I mean, not like I in no way am signed up for the kind of the broad vision of transhumanism. I don't like where they're headed, but there is a kind of a core of sympathy with where they're coming from, I suppose, which is the idea that, yeah, it kind of sucks that we all have to die. I think we can all agree with that, or it's controversial, I guess, but yeah, I mean that's where I come from initially, is this kind of terrified sort of encounter with my own mortality.
So that kind of brought you off on a road trip to meet some really interesting people and ideas.
Yeah.
So what sort of things are these people aspiring to do with themselves to prolong their lives? Or
Yeah, I mean, there's various kind of touch points in the movement. The things that I look at most kind of intently are ideas around. Well, I mean, I suppose like if you want to, I mean, it's a very broad church in a way, transhumanism, and there's no kind of one thing that they all believe. There's no sort of dogma to it. But the one thing that they tend to all be sort of oriented towards in terms of like their future ambitions for either themselves or for the human race as a whole is the idea that we would ultimately transcend our bodies, that we would sort of extract our minds from the sort of flesh and blood substrate that we're currently kind of operating on, and either upload ourselves to some kind of cloud type sort of disembodied intelligence, or upload ourselves to robots and sort of live eternally as ourselves, but in kind of third-party platforms or whatever. So that's one of the kind of central ideas of the kind of movement. So I look at other things like cryonics. I visited a cryonics facility in Arizona where people, I don't know how much you people know about cryonics, but basically it's the science, or really more accurately pseudoscience, of freezing recently deceased human bodies in liquid nitrogen and kind of putting them in storage until such time as technology or medical science becomes sophisticated enough that the bodies can be taken out of storage and sort of reconstituted or kind of defrosted and uploaded to machines, whatever. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff. And I also spent time with, there's a whole sort of self-proclaimed kind of cyborg subculture within transhumanism where people are kind of trying to hasten the post-humanist future themselves by kind of designing and building implantable technologies and putting these kind of technologies inside their own bodies and that kind of thing. So there's plenty of sort of weird and wonderful people out there. There was no shortage of like characters, for sure.
So tell us a bit about, I think there's in Alcor, there's a guy called Max Moore, is that right? Tell us a little bit about him.
Well, so Max is, in a way, like his background is, he's a philosopher. He kind of laid out the, I guess the sort of philosophical coordinates of the transhumanist movement back in the sort of late 80s and early 90s. He's a background as an Oxford PhD in philosophy, but he now runs this facility in Arizona called Alcor, which is this, I think it's the largest cryonics facility in the world. There are only really 4. There's 3 in the US and 1, I think, in Russia. And basically he presides over this kind of small to medium business whereby he takes sort of recently deceased corpses in and processes them and holds them for however long, dozens of centuries, however long it takes for technology to get its act together so that we can all kind of become immortal. And it's, I mean, the thing about cryonics is that obviously the science is pretty ropey, to say the least. And even the people who kind of sign up for it, most of them aren't fully convinced that it's a viable option.
Yeah.
But their kind of view of it is that, well, if you do sign up for cryonics, maybe at some point, technology will figure out a way to undo the cell degradation or whatever. It's a long shot, but it's at least worth a shot. If you don't sign up, you're never coming back. So
assuming they've preserved you correctly in the first place.
Assuming no one's pulled the plug, or there hasn't been a power outage, or civilization hasn't collapsed in the meantime, or whatever. Or assuming there's someone around in 1,000 years' time who's going to bother their ass, like bringing you back to life, whoever you are. So there's a lot of ifs in this whole kind of scenario.
And it's an expensive proposition, I think you were.
Well, you sign over your whole life insurance policy to Alcor, basically.
But there's a price differential, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I think it's like 150 grand to have just your head preserved, and it's maybe $250,000 to have your entire body. I forget the exact figures. But so most people, they're called patients, by the way. So when you go in here into Alcor and you walk around, I made the mistake of referring to them as corpses, which in a purely technical sense, of course they are, but within the kind of logic of cryonics, they're patients. Yeah. So, most patients are beheaded on intake. Largely because, well, A, the storage costs are cheaper. Heads are smaller than entire bodies. And B, because most people who sign up for Cryonics don't particularly want to come back in their old wrinkly deceased bodies. They want to like have the brains removed.
New version.
Yeah, they want to be uploaded to like super sexy kind of future sleek robots.
Yeah.
So
I was interested to read that Ray Kurzweil is heavily involved in this movement. Can you tell us a little bit about him? People may know him for other reasons.
Well, Kurzweil is currently the director of engineering at Google, and he's also sort of made a name for himself in the sort of 60s, 70s, and 80s as an inventor. So he's the inventor of the flatbed scanner and various kind of technologies that
musical instruments, I think.
Right, Kurzweil organs. So
Yeah.
he founded Kurzweil synthesizers with Stevie Wonder actually in I guess the 70s. But so he's kind of he's now director of engineering, as I said, at Google, and he is the sort of I guess the main proponent of this idea of the singularity. And the singularity is this kind of quasi-religious idea that grows out of the transhumanist movement and that grows out of lots of ideas around science fiction. And the notion, basically, I mean, it's incredibly complicated and sort of involved. And Kurzweil wrote this book in 2005 called The Singularity is Near, which is about 1,000 pages or whatever. And it's a deeply strange and kind of religious, almost, text. But the idea is that at a certain point in the future, he actually says 2045, he names a date, artificial intelligence is going to become so sophisticated and so powerful that almost as a kind of matter of inevitability, we are going to merge with artificial, superhuman level artificial intelligence. And at that point, all bets are off. Humanity becomes something completely different, much more powerful, much more intelligent than we are, and we become essentially a kind of a new species. And so, yeah, I mean, it's very much a kind of an eschatological end-time prophecy type notion. I mean, it's sort of often dismissively referred to as the rapture of the nerds, which is, I think, pretty accurate, actually.
Yeah. So not only do you transcend your body, you somehow become godlike.
Basically, we become gods. Yeah.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Well, it depends. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, so like the people that espouse these ideas, I mean, are they all just people who don't have another religious faith, or are there people from other religious ideas?
I mean, broadly speaking, if I had to characterize transhumanists as a group, they are all people who believe very wholeheartedly in. They believe themselves to be rationalists, so they believe in reason and science and all these kind of Enlightenment ideas, but they believe in them in a way so unquestioningly that it becomes almost, it sort of disappears over the horizon into sort of faith. So one of the things that I sort of play with and grapple with in the book is this kind of weird sort of paradoxical sort of middle ground between faith and reason, where reason becomes such an extreme kind of conviction that it leads you into believing all these objectively quite crazy things, you know. So that's the no man's land that I'm sort of operating in the book.
Okay. So, I mean, tell us a little bit about the Grindhouse guys that Grinder movement. Sorry, the Grinder movement guys that you.
Well, so I mentioned the sort of cyborg sort of scene within transhumanism, and so these are these guys who, and they're almost overwhelmingly all men, actually. I mean, maybe not surprisingly, but there's very few women in any of these kind of sub-movements. Thus far, yeah. No, I think it's something that appeals, for whatever reason, to men. Yeah. It's a specifically male kind of delusion, this notion of like extreme rationalism and so on. But so these Grindhouse guys are these people that I spent time with in Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, and they have a kind of a business, I suppose. They have like a laboratory beneath one of their houses where they design and build these kind of implantable technologies. And so when I got there, one of the guys, Tim Cannon, who's the kind of de facto leader of the group, had just had this gigantic sort of technology implanted in his forearm, about the size of a pack of cards, and he built it himself. And the idea was that it took sort of biometric measurements every so often, and he was like, he's a coder. Obviously, most of these people are sort of computer programmers, and so it allowed him to kind of create a sort of a feedback loop between himself and his computer, and also other things like such as if his body got too cold, his thermostat in his house would kick in, so he wouldn't have to get up from his laptop to go up and turn on the heat and stuff like that.
Instead of using his phone.
Right. Yeah. I mean, essentially, all these things are. But so the level of kind of superhuman capability that this stuff gives these people tends to be sort of very mildly superhuman capabilities, like the ability to like open a door or, like sense magnetic north or whatever. Things that you. I mean, they know themselves that they're not quite at the X-Men stage yet, but it's kind of a. It's almost like a sort of performance art. Extreme gesture of sort of provocation, like let's get the future started now, let's get out of our human kind of bodies and become something sort of more powerful or whatever. So yeah, these guys, Grindhouse Wetware, I spent a few days with, kind of just hanging out in their basement, breathing in the weed fumes and sort of getting high off their futurist ideas and so on. So yeah, they're an interesting bunch for sure.
So they sound like, I mean, the whole group thus far sound like a, slightly fringe.
Those guys are for sure.
Yeah. But there is, I mean, I think there is some. There's certainly money behind some scientific research in this.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, so like when I sort of first became aware of this movement, actually the first I heard of it was from Steve Coll, who's a defense journalist for the New Yorker, he's former editor of the Washington Times, and I talked to him years ago, and he happened to mention that he'd recently been at a party in Palo Alto, and he was kind of out the back during the party, and there was a few people standing around talking, and like two of the Google founders were there, and he kind of sort of asked them, like, at this point, I guess, they would have been in their mid-30s or whatever, and one of the questions that he asked them was like, so, you're still young, you've made an insane amount of money, you've kind of done everything that you wanted to do. What is it that you want to do now? What's the next project? And one of them, I can't remember, maybe it was Sergey, I think, said, we're going to conquer death. And so that's been kind of like, that's where my kind of interest in transhumanism comes from, is that it's as extreme as it is and kind of as fringe as it sometimes seems. There are people in positions of real power and wealth and authority in Silicon Valley who are every bit as signed up for these notions as the Grindhouse guys. And, so Google in 2014 set up a group called, a lot of you probably know about it, a group called Calico, which is kind of a biotech firm, which is explicitly predicated on extending human lifespans. And so Peter Thiel is another figure in all this. Peter Thiel is a kind of billionaire venture capitalist figure. He's sort of the white whale in my book, in a way. He's a founder of PayPal and early investor in Facebook. And so many of the technologies that I looked at and so many of the people that I talked to, so many of the scientists and entrepreneurs and so on, there was kind of a trend that I noticed very early on, that they were all funded or part funded by Thiel's various venture capital arms. And so he's very sort of monomaniacally invested, like literally in the idea of extending human lifespans, most pressingly his own lifespan, I think.
So it's sort of wealthy individuals and corporations rather than the NIH,
right?
Sort of funded these sorts of things.
Yeah.
So, and like again, it seems aspirational. I mean, did you meet any scientists that impressed you?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by impressed, I guess.
In terms of, I mean, I know you're not a scientist yourself, and you don't
not
claim to be.
No.
But in terms of the feasibility in your mind, in terms of what they told you about these technologies.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, that's one of the kind of sort of central aspects of the book, I suppose, in a way, is that I'm coming from this like really an outsider position. Like I have no prior knowledge of this world, but also I have no scientific grounding on which to judge these ideas. So I can't walk in and go, well, this doesn't work because A, B, and C, and the first principles are wrong or whatever. I'm purely relying on my sense that, well, this is just nuts, which is kind of an instinctual thing, obviously. And lots of things that do come to pass, lots of like great scientific innovations have seemed just nuts to people like me, and often to other scientists. But so I tend to sort of rely on the scientific consensus about these ideas. And certainly when it comes to things like radical life extension and brain uploading and these kinds of ideas, the scientific consensus is basically nah.
Yeah.
So, but like, did I meet people who impressed me as scientists? Yeah, definitely. I mean, so to take brain uploading again, or mind uploading. I mean, the scientific consensus generally is that this is such a remote possibility that it's really not even worth talking about at this point. But there are some figures who would be like very well-respected scientists who would say that it is certainly theoretically achievable. And so, yeah, I was interested to meet those people for sure. And that kind of sort of knocked me out of my kind of, skepticism a little bit. But by and large, my sort of overall approach in the book is not really to try and figure out whether these things are going to happen or not, whether the sort of post-human future is imminent or whatever. I'm much more interested in this kind of milieu as a way of getting at the sort of strangeness of the world we already live in, of our kind of faith in technology and progress as a culture, and the sort of power that Silicon Valley has particularly is kind of the underlying kind of sort of investigation of the book.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Faith in technology is a religion all in itself. Really.
Yeah.
So, like if the $6 million man was to be made now, I don't remember, was Steve Austin around 1970 something?
Yeah.
I mean, he's bound to be like hugely expensive. With inflation.
Yeah.
I mean, and even if they pull it together, this is going to be really, really expensive to do.
Yeah.
So who's going to benefit from it?
Well, I mean, it's interesting when you mention like the $6 million man. I don't really remember that show, but my sort of, but I do. Like my sense of it is that like that was the American government that was building that super soldier, right? Whereas now, I mean, I write about DARPA in the book as the kind of driver of a lot of this stuff.
So who are DARPA?
So DARPA is the sort of advanced research wing of the Pentagon, and they've they've got their fingers in a lot of very weird pies in terms of technology, but they're kind of quite invested in the idea of building super soldiers, of building kind of genetically and technologically enhanced, war fighters. But they've also kind of like they were instrumental in developing the technology that's now the internet and GPS and those kinds of things. So they have a fairly strong track record of sort of shifting the paradigms. But so I think in general, the transhumanist kind of movement and the people that I'm looking at, the sort of emphasis has shifted towards the private sector.
Yeah.
In the way that, say, it's not NASA taking us to Mars anymore, it's now Elon Musk. Similarly, it's private sort of enterprises, like people like Peter Thiel who are funding this kind of post-human future or whatever. And I think what Thiel is kind of is a pretty sort of illustrative example, I think. And I think you're right that, it's a big if, but if these technologies were to become feasible, I think they would be sort of monstrously expensive. And this is a conversation that goes on a little bit in transhumanist circles, like, well, how do we kind of make eternal life available to everyone? Or how do we make cognitive enhancements sort of more democratically available or whatever? But in general, what I saw when I was spending time with these people is that they're not terribly interested in democratizing these technologies. Actually, they're interested in it for themselves. And there's a strong kind of libertarian vein running through this movement in the same way as there's a strong libertarian vein running through Silicon Valley itself. One of the kind of most extraordinary quotes that I came across when I was researching the book was there's a New Yorker profile of Peter Thiel from, I think, 2011. And it sort of focuses on his interest in life extension technologies and his desire to defeat death. And one of the questions that the journalist who's profiling him asks is, well, if these technologies became available, wouldn't they inevitably just be available to very wealthy people, and wouldn't they therefore exacerbate kind of already existing social inequalities that are kind of already tearing society apart? And Thiel's answer just struck me as the most extraordinary thing. He just said, well, to me, the greatest form of inequality is the inequality that exists between people who are living and people who are dead. And I saw like versions of that. It's just extraordinary, but like I saw versions of that sort of sentiment
Yeah.
with most people that I spoke to for the book.
Okay.
The idea that this is the biggest problem that faces us. We just need to kind of realize that poverty is not poverty is a big problem. Sure, climate change is a big problem. All these things are serious, but surely the massive fucking thing is that we all die. And you all there's no bigger problem than the fact that we're all going to die. And in a way, you can kind of get into thinking like that. You can kind of go, yeah. It's kind of like a stoner philosophy kind of thing where it's like 4 a.m. and someone convinces you of something you've never seen before, and the veil falls away from your eyes. And so I did have moments where I was like, shit, maybe you're right, you know?
Yeah.
But for the most part, I've found myself kind of backed into almost sort of quite conservative positions of trying to make a case for death, actually. So I would have a version of this argument with most of the people that I spent time with, and I often got confused of what they call deathism, which is this term that they have for a kind of an ideology of death that most people have and that they don't have. And it's this idea that you basically, you know you're going to die. It's terrible, you know it's terrible, but you somehow convince yourself that it's maybe not such a terrible thing, which is basically Stockholm Syndrome. You've kind of backed yourself into a corner, and you know there's no way out. So maybe death is actually okay. And so people would say this to me, and there's no answer to it because I kind of think it's sort of true, actually. You know? So yeah.
So have you come across much of this in Dublin?
I did go to one transhumanist meetup in a Costa Coffee on Nassau Street. It was kind of, it wasn't, it didn't make it into the book. It was a bit weird. It was like people who were kind of interested in transhumanism but didn't really have any involvement. There was a guy who'd come up from his farm in Laois.
Really?
And he was kind of really into it, but he didn't
Have any?
No, he didn't know. He wasn't like, but it's funny, like one of the things that I found when I was writing the book was that I would talk to people about it and explain it to them, and people who would had never heard the term transhumanism would kind of go, "Oh yeah, I'd be into that," you know. Even my dad at one point was like, "Well, I wouldn't mind living forever, actually," you know. So it's like it's out there, and you know, you talk to people who would want to be uploaded to machines or whatever. Always men, never women.
There you go.
Yeah.
So maybe open it up to the floor. Oh my God! Look at this. Somebody got a microphone there, Eva.
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed that. I'm coming from a geriatric background, so my interest is in aging. And I was at a conference recently where they said there's 2 options for everyone here, and one of them is aging. But obviously, from the people that you're talking about, maybe they don't agree with that. And I was wondering if you came across any of them actually thinking about aging and tackling, because to conquer death, you would think that you would have to conquer aging.
Yeah. Well, so I would start with the caveat that, there are people who, like at various kind of levels, are working on the problem of like mortality through aging. Some of them are much more kind of ameliorative and sort of like incremental and sort of, you know, less vaultingly ambitious. But I did speak to a couple of people for the book. One of the people I spoke to was this very young woman called Laura Deming, who runs a venture capital fund. She's funded by Peter Thiel, actually. But she runs this venture capital fund in San Francisco that is kind of explicitly aimed at the life extension space. And so she invests in all kinds of technologies that, like, they tend to be kind of, we can push out the boundaries by like 5, 10, 15 years or whatever. And I also spoke to most of the people within transhumanism are all about just eradicating aging completely, just staying young forever. So there's a guy called Aubrey De Grey who is, and maybe you've heard of him, he pops up in the media every so often. He's a deeply gifted salesman. He's an amazing salesman. As a scientist, I could not tell you. My assumption is he's probably not a great scientist, but he gets a lot of attention, and again, he's funded by Peter Thiel. It strikes me that I've completely wandered off your question, but did I glance off maybe some kind of answer? Yeah.
There's somebody up there.
Just a comment that it's so striking how opposite to the Buddhist approach it is.
I did meet some transhumanist Buddhists, though.
How is that possible? I mean, it's like it is the most it's the most absolute instantiation of grasping at the ego
Yeah.
that could possibly be.
Yeah,
What is a
I never got a
transhumanist
satisfactory explanation as to how it was in any way in keeping with Buddhism, apart from like life is suffering and we should.
Did the
But-
people that you meet, did they strike you as happy people?
Like no more or less happy or unhappy than like your average sample of people. No, they didn't seem at all miserable. No, not at all. I mean, they seemed in a way like like driven people, you know.
Yeah.
Not in a kind of an anguished way, but just that they were optimistic, I suppose. And in a way, like the process of writing the book for me was like as much as it was a clash of like sort of like literary and scientific kind of worldviews and that C.P. Snow kind of way, it was very much a clash of like my pessimism philosophically and essentially, and this kind of radical optimism that I was having to kind of grapple with. Which isn't to say that they were all sort of happy-clappy types. They weren't. But definitely there's something about the idea that, you know, we're at this horizon and technology is going to kind of release us all from the purgatory of human existence. So it's a bit like being, I mean, I don't like describing them as like a group of religious fundamentalists or whatever, but there is something of the kind of apocalyptic kind of sect about transhumanism in places where they know the future, they know what's going to happen, and they're on board. And either you get on board or you don't, but they're saved.
There's some sort of strange pleasure in giving in to the anxiety in that way. So using the anxiety to make you frantically act, to get rid of the anxiety.
Right. Well, so Aubrey De Grey again. I mean, like his sort of sales pitch was basically that. Listen, like hundreds of thousands of people, or whatever the figure is, die every few hours from aging. This is a humanitarian catastrophe. We have to solve this. Like, get your heads out of your asses. What are we all doing? This is like he puts it like it's like if I manage to bring forward the if I manage to bring to push, but I can't even remember how he puts it. But it's like if he manages to solve death, and he's always saying that he's on the sort of verge of this sort of breakthrough that's going to eradicate aging. If he manages to bring forward the sort of the defeat of death by one day, that's like 70 September 11th that I've prevented. So, come on, this is like the biggest humanitarian catastrophe we've ever faced or ever will face. So there's a sense of like we're on the right side of history here to a lot of these people. So yeah, no, they're not unhappy, I don't think. I'd probably be happier if I believed in that stuff. Maybe, I don't know.
Oh, hi guys. Sorry.
Sorry.
I tell you what, we've got time for one from Mike, and we take one from the mob over here just to keep them quiet.
Thank you very much for that. Do you think we're seeing more people now, so diabetes is able to be better controlled now by people who have implantable pumps that secrete insulin that link to implantable glucose monitoring systems. So they're effectively replacing their organs with functioning technology. Yeah. I nearly ended up with a pacemaker last year, and when they were going through the pros and cons, the cardiologist said, look, I need to be honest about this. I need to consent you for the possibility that the Russians will hack your pacemaker and kill you.
Yeah.
Are we going to get a more practical form of transhumanism, do you think, coming out of the fact that we're already using machines as part of our bodies in a different way that isn't the extreme religious transhumanism that you're kind of talking about there?
Well, that's like one of the most interesting questions about all this, actually, is because like it depends. Like, so there's the issue of definition. Like, how do you define transhumanism? I mean, I tend to define it in a very kind of radical and extreme way because that's how the movement defines itself, and that's what I encountered. But there's a sense in which you can define transhumanism so broadly that it almost becomes, at a certain point, indistinguishable from medical science itself. So if you define it as like the desire to like improve the human condition through science and technology, I mean that's kind of what a lot of people in this room are engaged in. So yeah, you could say that like a pacemaker, if you're wearing a pacemaker, you're a cyborg, and therefore a pacemaker is a transhumanist technology. And there are lots of transhumanists who make exactly that argument that, if you're wearing glasses, if you're wearing a pacemaker, if you've got orthotics or whatever, you're essentially a cyborg. And also there's a philosophical kind of dimension to it, that like, how do you define humanity? What is a human? A human is something that uses tools in a certain way of defining it. So, yeah, I mean, in a way, we are all transhumanists. But in another way, it's completely running against the grain of medicine and of actual science. It's much more about the sort of the extreme belief in technology that Silicon Valley tends to have, much more so than medicine per se.
Question.
Mark, those fascinating insights. Yuval Harari, in his book *Sapiens*, on the history of us as a species, towards the end of the book, spoiler alert, he makes quite a strong case for arguing that a lot of aspects of transhumanism, especially around sort of cognitive and physical enhancements, would actually spell the end of us as a species and the end of our history.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if people that you've met, do they see it in that light? Do they see themselves as potentially, paradoxically signing the death cert for humans?
Yeah, I think they do, and I think they think that that's a good thing. And I think, actually, I don't know if you've read Harari's next book, which is Homo Deus, where he sort of, it's very much about this. It sort of expands on that last chapter. I think Harari is himself a transhumanist. I don't know how controversial that would be to say that, but I'm not sure he thinks all of these developments are necessarily a good thing, but he's definitely convinced, way more so than I am, that these things are coming and that they're inevitable, and that the future is a merger of technology and the human. But yeah, so transhumanists definitely see themselves as being the sort of last generation of men and women, of biological humans, or at least, maybe not the last generation, but that these technologies would bring us into something other than human sort of existence. And so, yeah, that's something that they see as a good thing. Like, the first chapter of the book, I write about this manifesto that was written by Max Moore, who's the guy I met at the Cryonics facility, and he wrote this really strange sort of text called an open letter to Mother Nature, where he basically says, it's a deeply strange thing. It's sort of, you don't have to be a sort of a philologist or whatever to decode the misogyny of it. But basically, he sort of says, "Thanks, Mother Nature. You've done a reasonably good job so far, but we're going to take it from here. We're going to we have the sort of powers of like reason and technology and so on, and I think we're going to take it from here." And so, yeah, like nature has done enough now, and like we're up next, and we're going to be something other than natural, and we're going to be something better and more kind of more powerful and cleverer, and yeah.
So I think we're nearly out of time. What I think one of the great things about this book is the writing, and I think it'd be a shame not to get Mark to read something from the book. Like what moved me most about the book, really, Mark, is your own reaction to the people that you met and how it made you reflect on your own humanity and what it's like to be a human being. And there's a particularly touching part.
Okay. Yes.
But it might be nice to read from there.
Sure. So this is actually towards the end of the chapter that I write about brain uploading. And so like the part of the process of writing the book was, because I just had a child, I couldn't travel for very long periods, so I would go away usually to California for like 10 days or at the most, really, and I would come back. And so I was constantly kind of shuttling back and forth between this kind of world of like extreme techno-rationalism and my own young child and my wife in Dublin. So this is one of those kind of passages in the book. One morning, some months after I returned from that trip to San Francisco, I was at home in Dublin, suffering from both a head cold and a hangover, the severity of which latter condition seemed to me out of all reasonable proportion to the moderate amount I'd drunk the previous night. I lay there, idly considering hauling myself out of the bed to join my wife and my son, who were in his bedroom next door, enjoying a raucous game of buckaroo. I realized that these conditions, head cold, hangover, had imposed upon me a regime of mild bodily estrangement, As happens often when I'm feeling under the weather, I had a sense of myself as an irreducibly biological thing, an assemblage of flesh and blood and gristle. Ugh. I felt myself to be an organism with blocked nasal passages, a bacteria-ravaged throat, a sorrowful ache deep within its skull, its cephalon. I was aware of my substrate, in other words, because my substrate felt like shit. And I was gripped by a sudden curiosity as to what precisely that substrate consisted of, as to what I myself happened, technically speaking, to be. I reached across for the phone on my nightstand and entered into Google the words, "What is the human?" The first 3 autocomplete suggestions offered, "What is the human centipede about?" And then, "What is the human body made of?" And then, "What is the human condition?" It was the second question I wanted answered at this particular time, as perhaps a back door into the third. It turned out that I was 65% oxygen, which is to say that I was mostly air, mostly nothing. After that, I was composed of diminishing quantities of carbon and hydrogen, of calcium and sulfur and chlorine, and so on down the elemental table. I was also mildly surprised to learn that, like the iPhone I was extracting this information from, I also contained trace elements of copper and iron and silicon. What a piece of work as a man, I thought. What a quintessence of dust. Some minutes later, my wife entered the bedroom on her hands and knees, our son on her back, gripping the collar of her shirt tight in his little fists. She was making clip-clop noises as she crawled forward, and he was laughing giddily and shouting, "Don't buck! Don't buck!" With a loud neighing sound, she arched her back and sent him tumbling gently into a row of shoes by the wall, and he screamed in delighted outrage before climbing up again. None of this, I felt, could be rendered in code. None of this, I felt, could be run on any other substrate. Their beauty was bodily in the most profound sense, in the saddest and most wonderful sense. I never loved my wife and our little boy more, I realized, than when I thought of them as mammals. I dragged myself, my animal body, out of bed to join them.
Thanks, Mark.